cadets and everybody who's preparing for a flight test. Today is the end of week 4 of this year's DND Air Cadets program, and this week I have done 8 pre-flight tests for our candidates, preparing them. And I just wanted to quickly record this video as a feedback of some common mistakes that I have seen, and something that will hopefully prepare all of you better for the next week's flight tests. And again, these flight tests are regular PPL flight tests. They are not cadet specific, so anybody can implement those as well. So I will go one report after the other. And so this is why I may be coming back to the same exercises more than once. But I'll just go in this order. Feel free to take notes and reorganize them. We're on one single day off every week on Sunday, so I'll try to make it quick and nice and efficient for everybody. Starting with the first one, when you're starting the engine, definitely you never want to prime with the throttle or move the throttle back and forth multiple times. First of all, that's not a proper procedure, but also it's something that can cause potentially engine fire, would not be good. When you're taxiing, make sure you do your taxiing instrument checks, and you also position your control inputs for wind. If by any chance you don't have the actual wind, you can specify, or the wind is very light, specify the direction that you believe it is, or ask the examiner which direction is the wind coming from, so that you can demonstrate you have the knowledge and the skill to put the proper control inputs for wind. If there's anything that is the most common mistake in the upper air work, I'm jumping forward here, is the poor lookout. And lookout is something that is directly safety. If you are doing a perfect steep turn, you're looking at instruments, it's a 1. It's like no questions about it. If you have a good lookout and maybe you have a little bit of deviation, but all within tolerances, chances are you will pass that exercise. So make sure you have good lookout, do the hull check before a slow flight, before each stall. You are better over checking than under checking. And then before any turn, make sure you lift the wing if you're in a Cessna, confirm it's clear, and then initiate the turn. Very, very important to have that lookout, to have that awareness. There's lots of other planes flying in the practice area, and you don't want to scare the examiner because you're potentially getting into a midair, or even a remote possibility of having a midair collision. Stalls also have to be called. What that means is you have recognized the stall, you have to verbalize stall and then recover. We kind of know that you have recognized because you have initiated the recovery, but the flight test guide specifically says that you do have to call the stall. So please make sure you do both for power off and power on stall. When you are doing a stall recovery, also make sure that you lower the nose enough below the horizon, and don't be in a rush to bring it back up. It's okay to have the nose below the horizon for a few seconds for the aircraft to pick up speed, get back to cruise speed, and then you level out. You don't have to reclimb to your original altitude, and definitely you don't need to rush because that's a risk of a secondary stall. Another very common mistake I have seen is a slip. So a slip is a maneuver that is used to lose altitude, meaning you first need to bring the power back, establish a descent, and then initiate a slip, forward slip, or slip and turn, whichever one we might be doing in the practice area. Then you demonstrate it that way. If you do not bring the power back, it kind of defeats the purpose of the exercise of losing altitude, and that's not a proper way of doing it. Backtracking now to our circuits at the airport, takeoffs, landings. What I have commonly observed, it kind of caught some of you by surprise that I did ask for a short field over an obstacle landing, or short field takeoff over an obstacle. So flight test guide specifically says that both takeoff and landing will be over an obstacle. For soft field, You may or may not have an obstacle, and same for normal, but for short field, you will on the flight test have an actual or simulated obstacle. Usually it's 50 foot somewhere at the airport fence, but can be 200 feet, can be a different location. The examiner will specify, but you will have an obstacle. Now, when we are coming in for landing for short field, you need to specify where you will touch down. And from there on, you need to make your stabilized descent gradually and to touch down at that point. What you should not be doing is to keep it above the obstacle and then cut the power and drop. So it has to be all along, nice and stable approach over an obstacle. So figure out your angles, but don't chop and drop. For normal and short field landing, you'll need to specify where you will touch down. Don't aim for the numbers. 500-foot markers or 1,000-foot markers are a good aim. Or if you're on our 2-6 right, where you don't have 500 and 1,000-foot markers, you can use the hash marks in the middle of the runway and say first or second hash mark after the numbers is would be good aiming point. Numbers or the threshold is way too early, especially that you have a fence close to the runway threshold. You don't want to be too low. And if you have a gust of wind, you definitely don't want to land before the runway. So don't take that risk on the takeoff or even on the landing. If you're dragging out too long, for soft field, you don't have a specific point. You have first a third of the runway that you need to touch down. If you're on runway 26 right, especially if you haven't touched down by halfway and you clearly have a sign, it's halfway down the runway. If you have not touched down by that time, you have to go around because you will not have sufficient runway to touch down and safely stop. It's way too dicey. Don't take that chance. Even on the flight test, you are better off making a safe call to go around than trying to force an unsafe landing. Never do that. Ideally, you should recognize that it's too high of an approach and initiate the go around earlier. But at the latest, if you see you are past the third, you see you're approaching halfway mark and you haven't touched down, just go around. That's a safe thing to do. Do not force the landing. Takeoff. Make sure on the soft field that you do have your flaps, that you do the ground effect. So absence or low ground, like almost no ground effect was very common. If it's a short field, make sure you apply brakes, hold them, bring the power up, confirm the static RPM, and only then release the brakes. Flaps. So once you have cleared the obstacle, so up to an obstacle, if there is one specified, you should be climbing at VX. If the obstacle is at 50 feet, you don't need to climb at VX to 500 feet. Just clear the obstacle. Technically 51 foot, you can start transitioning to your VY. Before retracting flaps, you need to verbalize safe airspeed, meaning VY or higher. Safe altitude, meaning minimum 200 feet. And then you retract flaps. So you shouldn't be at VX or lower and retracting flaps. You shouldn't be retracting flaps at 50 feet. So VY and minimum 200 feet, and then you retract flaps, and then you continue your climb. When you are landing short field, you have touchdown. Before you apply brakes, raise the flaps, and only then apply brakes. Brakes have to be safe. Don't jam the brakes. Most of the time it's a simulated one anyway, so you don't want to harm the plane by forcing abrupt braking. And again, abrupt braking will bring down your mark most likely, even on a properly executed short field landing. But if you're too abrupt on the brakes, it's still not good. Back to the practice area, forced approaches. I don't want you to ever go below 500 feet. If you're dual with your instructor, or if you are by yourself, definitely this is our school policy. Now, keep in mind the examiner will call you, go around, call you overshoot. So in that case, you can ask if the examiner wants you to overshoot, or if they want to continue to confirm if you made the field or not. That's for the flight test. However, when you're practicing by yourself for safety purposes, don't go below. Typically from 500 feet, you would see if you are making the field or not making the field, chances are at that time examiner will also call your go around. Make sure you do your engine warm-ups throughout the descent. And as you're doing the checklist, most of the time, your passenger briefing, your cost check, all of that was good. But the common error I have seen is you are not using the checklists. So not using the checklist, bring your mark down. Most likely it's a 2 just for not using it. It's just such an easy mark to get. You have done all by memory, and you pull out your emergency checklist to re-verify that you have done what's needed. Now, when I'm talking 1 to 4 point marking scale, obviously 4 is our great performance, 3 minor deviations, but still good. You have to watch for 2. A single 2 would not make you fail your flight test. However, if you're getting 8 2s, that's a failed flight test, because that means, and there's 8 exercises where there has been a major error. A single 1 will make it a fail. You may be able to retest if it's just within 2 exercises, no more than 2 at once. You may be able to retest, but the maximum number of 1s and 2s combined can only be 5. If it's if you have the 6th one, it's a full retest. So even if you have like only 6 2s, it's a full retest. So the 6 2 could be just not using the checklist, and that would be a shame to like have the whole thing redone just because of that. So watch for it. Communication-wise, for the most part, the requests were good to the tower. Tower communication was okay. Make sure that you do listen to all tower calls and all the position reports in the practice area. It might not be directly addressed to you. It's still the important information for you that you know maybe there is a traffic ahead of you potentially, or somebody is following you, or they could be a delay and you need to slow down your approach speed because you think the traffic in front of you may take longer, like in a stop and go instead of touch and go. So always listen, which means you cannot listen and talk at the same time. Stop talking and listen to the transmissions. Once you have listened to them, continue whatever you need to say to verbalize. Going to the next one. Taxiing, again, restarting here from the beginning. Like I said, I'll be going through the exercises back and forth. When you're taxiing, checking the brakes, power has to be all the way back, then apply brakes, never brakes in power. You don't do it in your car, you don't do it on the plane. Before the takeoff, all the lights have to be on. It's not a legal requirement, but because our practice areas are so congested, so busy, even by daytime, having your strobe lights makes you so much more visible. Turn your landing light. We have in some aircraft a pulsing landing light. Nav lights shine like a Christmas tree. That makes you more visible, that keeps you safe. In the practice area, LED lights, they're not drawing that much energy. They just turn everything on and be visible. Just going through the notes here, same, for the most part, similar or same errors, ground effects, lookout. Something that I had probably only on 1 or 2 is to watch for flaps. If you are having slow flight with flaps or stall with flaps, once you're recovering, the speed is picking up, maybe not that drastically and fast, but it's picking up nevertheless. So you don't ever want to exceed the wide arc. Flaps were extended while in the wide arc, but you cannot fly higher beyond the wide arc if you still have the flaps extended. So make sure you remember to retract flaps when you're recovering from slow flight or stall. Approaches for landing, I would like to see them at nice angle that ideally, if your engine fails, you can still make it to the runway. You might be a little bit lower than that, but I definitely don't want to see a dragging approach where you're almost ground effect half a mile away from the runway. So I'm exaggerating here, obviously, but car roofs, tree tops and stuff should be remaining way below you. Obviously not too high, but dragging approach where you're heavily relying on your engine is not a good idea, because we typically don't have lots of good stuff just before the runway, not where you want to land. When you're specifying in the practice area which field you will go for, don't tell me in Glen Valley I'm going for that green field, because pretty much 3 dozen of them are all green. Good landmarks would be, I have 2 red barns and there is a light green field with the 2 red barns on the right. I will land westbound, or narrow green field, light green between the 2 dark green, point out, but have some more specific description. You can practice by looking at Google Maps and seeing how you would describe certain fields. Do some practice. You will not always have it in Glen Valley. You can have some other area. Keep in mind that other areas can be at different altitudes. So it's not always sea level. For Kamloops, definitely never sea level over there. So gauge your altitude. Again, roughly 500 you want to go around. But you also want to be not too high, not too low, so the proper approach that you can make it there. A navigation on departure, I would like to hear the ETA right away. So you have obviously taken care of your takeoff, write down the time, level off, you are in your cruise climb, departure is like, okay, our takeoff was 10:05, our Chile walk ETA will be 10:30. Local time is fine, just provide that initial ETA without the examiner asking. When you are departing, set up your set heading point. When you're going to your set heading point, don't cross the path of the arrival traffic. Find something that is on your way out. If you're taking off 26 right, use Thornhill. Don't go to Fort Langley, because you'll be crossing the path of the arriving traffic, which is flat, for example. And when you are navigating from your set heading point to your ground speed check, don't just fly around, be useful. Do your navlog, double check that what's in your navlog is what you are actually flying. Do any drift corrections as needed. Calculate your true airspeed. You have the temperature, you have the speed. Like, okay, in my navlog, I planned on 96 knots of true airspeed. I'm doing 90 right now, so 6 knots less. How it will affect. I don't need a revised ETA based on that, but kind of have an estimate, like it looks like we are slower today. Maybe it will take us more time, so potentially more fuel. Or to the contrary, we are going faster. That's great. When you're doing ground speed check, then you're calculating your ETA. Again, you should spontaneously provide that information without being asked. In emergency, so you will not have a combined exercise. You will not have cross-country and then an emergency on top of it. So that will always be separate. But when you do, again, back to the checklist, have the checklist used every single time on any emergency. Even if you do it by memory, double check with the checklist. Diversion is also navigation. It's unprepared navigation. You are not allowed to use anything but your map and the pencil, and should be no notches or markings on the pencil. So that's all you can do, and then you do your circle line and all that good stuff. You cannot use A6B, you cannot use rulers, protractors, any of that. When you're doing your calculation, the best is just to start going in the direction you are going. So if you are in the practice area going back to Pitt Meadows or Kamloops, okay, I'm roughly there. I will pick, for example, Macmillan Island or whichever landmark you recognize in that direction. That will be my set heading point. While I'm flying there straight and level, I will do my calculations. It's always more comfortable and better than circling low level in more unstable position than straight and level, so how being banked. And you're looking inside because you're doing the calculation and not doing the lookout, or as good of a lookout if you were just navigating and flying. So not a good combination to circle. My preference would be just go in the general direction where you plan on going and do your calculation. If you haven't finished it by your set heading point, that's okay. Just write down the time over the set heading point, and maybe you finish it 10, 20, 30 seconds later. That's fine. You'll go on your heading and it's all good. Watch for skidding always circuits, forced approaches all the time. Watch your approach speed. If you're approach speed actually on both short and soft field. If you're saying we are approaching at 60 knots, that's fine. Approach at 60 knots. If you're saying 65, okay. I would prefer 60 knots when you're with full flaps because that's closer to the POH numbers. You don't need to go like 55 or whatever the numbers are, because that would be too slow, because then if you deviate, we're still watching by how much you deviate and it gets really uncomfortable, really slow. So 60 is fine with full flaps, 65 without flaps, but you would be using full flaps even on normal landing by now. So 60 is a good approach speed. Make sure you don't go lower, don't go much higher, but don't give me a range. It's not approach 60 to 65, pick a number. And then maybe you fly in 62 for a little bit of margin, that's fine. But your approach speed, your target speed should be one number, not a range. Departure from Pit Meadows specifically, 2500 is not a good idea because you are right at the border of the terminal airspace. And if en route portion, you have the tolerance of about 200 feet plus and minus. Here, if you climb even like 50 feet, you are already failing the exercise because you enter terminal airspace without clearance. So my recommendation, aim for 22 or 2300 on departure, just to not to take away intentionally your own margin that you do have as per the flight test guide. Spiral dive recovery. Somehow a couple of times I have seen that power back, roll out, come out of the dive, do not add power. First wait to go back to straight and level, check your speed, make sure you're at cruise speed. You will probably have in the spiral dive, the speed will build up pretty quickly. So you will need to dissipate that speed. Once you are comfortable to a straight and level, only then you add more power as needed, but don't be in a rush. It's not part of the recovery. The recovery from a spiral dive is power back, roll out, ease out of the dive. Yeah, not too much more new from here. Like I said, those are very repeated mistakes, which is good in the sense that they are consistent and they will be hopefully fixed in bulk. Obviously, things like too high speed, like 80 knots on approach and 152 is on the high side. And here I have a note that bounce touchdown. Again, that's a no-no, but probably coming from that unstable approach at very high speed. And soft field landing has to have that touch of power for the touchdown. You don't have to have that power all throughout the descent. You might need to bring the power back because you're too high, but make sure you have that touch of power prior to touchdown, even like a second or two before the touchdown, just to make the touchdown actually soft. Leaning was a big thing. Leaning both on the ground and in the air. So whenever you're taxiing, lean the mixture. Yes, you have to make it reach for the run-up. Make it back lean when you're taxiing for takeoff and reach again on takeoff. Once you have reach the circuit height or so, like depending if you're level or climbing, but once you leveled off at whatever altitude, you don't have to be at 3,000 feet. You can even do it lower. If you're flying at 2,500 feet the entire time with mixture reach, you will foul the spark plugs. And some of you have seen and even have seen the cancellations of the flights because the engine was running rough, and that was exactly the fouled spark plugs. And 99.9% of the time, it's coming from too rich of a mixture, not enough leaning. And some of them mechanics have shown to you that they were completely fouled. There's like every single bit of it. So don't be the problem in the plane. Make sure you lean the mixture every opportunity you have. It also saves the environment, and we are using less fuel, which is good for everyone. So do the right thing and safe thing and correct thing as per the checklists. Next one. Instruments. When you're calling any instrument indications or pointing it out, never touch down the glass on the instruments. It's a very thin one. You can easily crack it. If you really need to show or to tap or whatever, just you can touch the plastic around it or tap on the plastic if you really have to. Typically you don't, but don't touch the instruments. We don't need your fingerprints there. Another housekeeping item, don't do the run up with the window open. It does damage the latch from that vibration and being constantly in the big airflow. It's not designed for it. Another housekeeping item, don't put headsets and knee boards on the dash. You have seen on the plexiglass, there is a bunch of small scratches, unfortunately, in many planes, and they are coming exactly from people putting stuff on the dashboard. If you are just putting your phone or the keys, that's okay. That's a small item and typically doesn't slide away. Headsets and knee boards is big and usually have rough metal corners, and that damages the soft plexiglass. When you're doing an overshoot, make sure you do so you first put the full power on and then retract flaps in stages, never full flaps up right away. You're not on the runway, you are transitioning into the overshoot while you're flying. If you're putting from full flaps to zero flaps, it's too much of reconfiguration right away. So make sure you do it in stages, control your airspeed, and as long as the airspeed is safe, make sure you do climb. Your purpose is not to accelerate, your purpose is to get further away from the ground. When you're checking and figuring out which field you are going for, you pick the field, you cannot change your mind. Unless you could have made that original field, and then you're saying, okay, this field I could have made, but I now realize there's a tractor or there is a cow on it that I didn't see from higher up. So I will go on the field right beside it, which is also good, but there's no tractor. But that has to be that you could have made the first field. You cannot say it's like, oh, I'm not making this field, I'll go for the next one. Or I cannot make that field, I'll land here. That's not allowed. That is considered that you could not have made the original field. The purpose of the exercise is not achieved and it will be a failed exercise. And I would pick the field first. This way you know where you are going and planning your approach accordingly, and then we jump on all your checklists, because checklists are of not much use if in the process you are going away from your selected field and at the end of the day not making a good approach and good landing. Make sure you do listen to the traffic control, you listen to the examiner, you listen to the instructions. If you're missing clearances or missing instructions or doing something else, again, can be held against you. All install, same thing, using checklist, ground effect on the soft field takeoff. When you're doing short field takeoff, make sure you do request a short delay. You cannot ask the tower for a takeoff. They gave you a clearance and then you decide to stop on the runway. Tower is planning the traffic accordingly and the separation. So when you're planning a short delay, you need to let the tower know about it. One thing I have seen on many takeoffs, cadets were taking off and then looking back to look at the runway. You don't need to do that. And in fact, it destabilizes the plane because you're flying and now you're starting looking back, and in the process, you end up turning the plane. It's not a good idea. If you want to make sure that you're following the extended center line, you know the area on the takeoff, you have seen, for example, there is that island or there is that bridge in front of you when you're following the runway heading, or you just have your heading indicator. Look at one of those either landmarks or instrument indications to confirm you're going in the right direction, but don't look back. It's not as critical as sort of the damage that you are doing by doing so. When you're doing soft field takeoff, usually the scenario is that the runway is the entire surface is soft field, not when you start your takeoff roll. Meaning that when you are entering the runway, you should be already applying the back pressure and holding it back all throughout your taxiing into position. As you are adding power, you will need less than the full back pressure. You will be slowly releasing it, not to have it too aggressive and not to hit the tail. 152 is not a tail dragger. Don't make it one. So with the acceleration, and then you will transition into the ground effect and do your acceleration from there. But you will not be taxiing into position and then, realize it's like now from this point on, it's grass. No, usually it's the entire runway surface. And on the soft field, we do avoid braking. So ideally, we taxi continuously into position and then go for our takeoff roll. We don't stop on the runway, because if it was an actual soft field, chances are you will just sink, dig in, whatever, depends how soft the field it actually is. You want to keep moving. And same thing after landing, don't jam the brakes. Ideally, barely touch the brakes, if ever, depending where the exit is. So you would land, keep that nose wheel off the ground, so apply some back pressure, not necessarily full as required. And then when you're leaving, you will taxi off the runway again, continue taxiing slowly. Now, if you need to gently apply brakes, obviously you will do that, but again, don't jam the brakes. It's a bad idea on the soft field landing. And the last comment was the traffic communication. Just a reminder, whenever the tower tells you to hold short, you need to read back with the call sign. So if they say November Juliet Foxtrot, hold short, 26 left, you have to read back exactly this: hold short, 26 left, November Juliet Foxtrot. You cannot just say, okay, Roger. They need to hear hold short, and they need to hear your call sign that you have acknowledged that. All right, this is all I have so far from this pre-flight tests this week. Hopefully it will be helpful. I suggest everybody watches it, not only those who have flown with me. You might recognize what you have done in the flight. It doesn't matter. This is something that is common, and we can all learn and improve from that. So let me know if you have questions. I see you all tomorrow morning. Happy Sunday.